October 26, 1942. 3 o'clock in the morning. A rain-soaked ridge south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The last line between 200 Japanese soldiers and America's most vital airstrip in the Pacific. Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige crouched behind 4 outdated machine guns, the old Browning M, 1917 models, that headquarters said were too heavy, too slow, relics from the last war. Each gun weighed 93 pounds, fully assembled. Each required a 3-man crew just to operate effectively. The Marine Corps had been phasing them out for newer, lighter models that could keep pace with the fluid tactics of Pacific warfare. But as Japanese artillery thundered from across the Guadalcanal River and enemy infantry poured through the jungle darkness, Paige discovered something the textbooks never mentioned. His 33 Marines lay scattered across defensive positions that commanded the southern approach to the airfield. The ridge was the only thing protecting Henderson Field from direct assault, and those outdated machine guns, the weapons that every tactical manual said were obsolete for modern warfare, were about to prove that sometimes the oldest tools hit the hardest when defending ground you cannot afford to lose. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight on Guadalcanal, turning the red clay soil into a slick, treacherous mess that clung to everything. Boots, rifle stocks, machine gun tripods. By the evening of October 25, 1942, the Marines of the 1st Division had grown accustomed to the constant dampness, the way their uniforms never quite dried, the metallic taste of moisture that seemed to hang permanently in the tropical air. But Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige wasn't thinking about the rain as he supervised his machine gun section's final preparations on the ridge south of Henderson Field. He was thinking about angles of fire, fields of observation, and the 4 water-cooled Browning M 1917 machine guns that would either hold this line or watch it crumble under the weight of what intelligence reports suggested was coming. The ridge itself rose perhaps 60 feet above the jungle floor, its spine running roughly east to west, positioned like a natural barrier between the vital airstrip at Henderson Field and the dark expanse of jungle that stretched toward the Guadalcanal River. From their elevated positions, Paige's 33 Marines could see down into the ravine that Japanese forces would have to cross to reach the airfield. The tactical advantage was clear enough: plunging fire from the high ground, overlapping fields of fire, natural obstacles that would channel any assault into predictable corridors. What concerned Paige was not the terrain, but the tools he had been given to defend. The 4 machine guns arrayed along his section of the ridge were relics from the previous war. Each Browning M 1917 weighed 93 pounds when mounted on its tripod, a massive chunk of steel and brass that required 3 men to operate effectively. 1 gunner to aim and fire, 1 assistant gunner to feed ammunition belts, 1 ammunition bearer to keep the weapon supplied with the endless belts of 30 caliber rounds it consumed. The water-cooled jacket that surrounded each barrel could hold nearly 4 liters of water, essential for sustained fire, but adding considerable weight to an already cumbersome weapon system. These guns had been designed for the static trench warfare of 1917, where weight mattered less than the ability to fire continuously for hours without the barrel melting from heat stress. By 1942, military doctrine was shifting toward lighter, air-cooled weapons that infantry could carry and reposition quickly during fluid advances. The newer Browning M 1919 was half the weight, easier to transport, better suited to the rapid tactical movements that characterized Pacific warfare, where Marines had to advance through jungle terrain that made every piece of heavy equipment a burden. But Henderson Field had been built with whatever equipment the Marines could bring ashore during those frantic first weeks of August, and the M 1917s had been available in the supply system. Now, 2 months later, as Japanese forces massed for what intelligence reports suggested would be their largest assault yet, these outdated weapons represented the primary defensive firepower for this critical sector. Paige had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1936, old enough to have absorbed the institutional memory of the Great War, while young enough to adapt to the evolving demands of amphibious warfare in the Pacific. He understood that the M 1917's weight was both a liability and an asset that required careful tactical thinking. Yes, the guns were difficult to move quickly once positioned. but once dug in properly, they could maintain rates of fire that would shred attacking infantry formations with a mechanical efficiency that lighter weapons simply could not match. The effective cyclic rate was 450 to 600 rounds per minute, fed by cloth ammunition belts that held 250 rounds each. More importantly, the water-cooled system meant these guns could fire continuously without the barrel changes required by air-cooled weapons that would overheat after sustained bursts. In a defensive engagement where the enemy had to cross open ground under direct observation, that sustained fire capability could be the difference between holding the line and watching it collapse. As darkness settled over the ridge, Paige moved from position to position, checking sight alignments, ammunition stockpiles, and communication lines back to battalion headquarters. Each gun was positioned to cover specific approach routes from the jungle below, with overlapping fields of fire that would create what military manuals called interlocking fires, areas where multiple weapons could engage the same targets simultaneously, creating kill zones that no infantry formation could cross without taking devastating casualties. The leftmost gun covered the steep ravine where Japanese forces would most likely attempt their main assault, the natural corridor that offered the most direct route to the ridge. The rightmost gun was angled to catch any flanking movement along the ridge's eastern slope, positioned to sweep the approaches that clever enemy commanders might use to avoid the main defensive positions. The two center guns provided depth and redundancy, ready to shift fire to support whichever flank came under pressure first. Between the gun positions, Paige had rigged an early warning system that reflected both his practical experience and his understanding of jungle warfare, where visual observation was nearly impossible after dark. Key ration cans, emptied of their contents and strung on tripwires at ankle height, created a crude but effective detection network. Any Japanese soldier moving through the undergrowth in darkness would inevitably snag these wires, causing the cans to rattle and alert the Marines to infiltration attempts before the enemy could close to grenade range. It was a simple solution to a complex problem: how to detect enemy movement through dense vegetation when darkness and rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. The metal cans would provide a few precious seconds of warning, time enough for gunners to traverse their weapons and bring fire to bear on approaching troops before they could overwhelm the defensive positions. The Japanese 2nd Division had been moving south along what Marines had dubbed the Maruyama Road, a jungle trail that wound from the Matanikau River toward the Lunga Point perimeter that protected Henderson Field. Intelligence reports indicated that Major General Yumio Nasu's 29th Infantry Regiment was spearheading this advance, with explicit orders to seize Henderson Field and drive American forces back to the beaches where naval gunfire could finish what ground troops started. The timing of the assault was no accident, representing careful Japanese planning. Naval forces were simultaneously bombarding American positions from offshore, while aircraft from Rabaul pounded the airfield itself, trying to destroy the American planes that made Henderson Field so strategically valuable. This was intended to be the decisive blow that would restore Japanese control over Guadalcanal and eliminate the Allied foothold in the Solomon Islands that threatened their entire defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. For Paige and his Marines, the strategic implications were clear but abstract. Their immediate concern was more basic and more urgent. 33. Men with 4 heavy machine guns tasked with holding a ridge that commanded the southern approach to the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific. The airfield behind them represented months of American blood and effort, the forward edge of a campaign that would determine whether the United States could project power deep into Japanese-held Pacific territory or would be forced back to a defensive perimeter thousands of miles away. As the evening wore on, the sounds of the jungle began to change in ways that every experienced Marine recognized. The normal chorus of insects and nightbirds gradually gave way to more ominous noises, the distant rumble of artillery preparing for bombardment, the crack of small arms fire from other sectors of the perimeter where Japanese probes were testing the American line, the occasional flare lighting up patches of sky to the west, illuminating nothing but creating the kind of nervous tension that preceded major attacks. Radio communications crackled with reports of Japanese activity along various sections of the line, enemy forces testing for weak points, gathering intelligence for the main assault that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict with certainty. In the foxholes and gun positions around him, Marines made final adjustments to equipment, wrote quick letters home that might never be mailed, or simply sat in silence, each man processing the approaching battle in his own way. Some had been fighting since the initial landing in August, veterans who understood exactly what was coming and what it would cost. Others were recent replacements, experiencing their first major engagement and trying not to show the fear that every rational person felt before combat. All understood that when dawn came, if they were still alive and still holding this ridge, Henderson Field would remain in American hands. If they failed, the entire Guadalcanal campaign might collapse within days. The rain continued to fall with the relentless consistency of tropical storms, drumming against helmet covers and pooling in ammunition boxes that had to be constantly monitored to keep the belts dry. In the distance, Japanese artillery began its preliminary bombardment, shells whistling overhead toward targets deeper within the American perimeter. But on the ridge, Paige's section waited in relative quiet, listening to the sound of their own breathing and the rattle of rain on metal. 4 obsolete machine guns and 33 Marines standing between the Japanese army and the airstrip that had become the symbol of American determination in the Pacific War. The weapons that military doctrine said were too heavy for modern warfare, the guns that every tactical manual suggested replacing with lighter, more mobile alternatives. They were about to demonstrate that in defensive warfare, sustained fire mattered more than mobility, and that the oldest designs sometimes worked best when the mission was simple: hold the line, stop the enemy, refuse to yield ground regardless of the cost. Paige checked his watch one final time as midnight approached. The Japanese would come soon. They always did. The only questions were where they would hit hardest, and whether 4 water-cooled machine guns could deliver enough sustained fire to break an assault by forces that intelligence estimated at over 2,000 men. The mathematics were not encouraging. But mathematics had never stopped Marines from defending positions they were ordered to hold. The first rattle of sea ration cans came at 0300 hours, a metallic chatter that cut through the constant drum of rain like a dinner bell announcing the start of hell. Paige rolled from his shallow fighting hole and low-crawled toward the nearest machine gun position, his hands already reaching for the traverse and elevation controls, before his eyes had fully adjusted to the jungle darkness that concealed everything beyond a few yards. Through the mechanical rain and the distant thunder of artillery, he could hear what every Marine defender dreaded most: the sound of many men moving through dense vegetation, trying to be quiet, and failing because silence was impossible when hundreds of soldiers pushed through undergrowth, carrying full combat loads. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had finally arrived at the base of the ridge, and they were not coming in small patrols or reconnaissance elements testing the defenses. This was the main assault. Hundreds of soldiers carrying rifles, grenades, and the kind of determination that came from months of preparation and explicit orders to take Henderson Field at any cost, regardless of casualties. Paige could see them now through breaks in the foliage, dark silhouettes emerging from the tree line at the bottom of the ravine, moving in loose formations that spoke of experienced jungle fighters who understood how terrain and cover could negate superior firepower if they could close the distance quickly enough. His tactical plan was brutally simple, refined through years of machine gun training and months of jungle warfare. Make them pay for every yard of ground with such overwhelming fire that their assault would collapse before reaching the ridgeline. The 4 M1917s were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire ravine, each gun capable of sweeping designated sectors with sustained bursts that would cut down attacking infantry formations like wheat before a scythe. But the plan only worked if all 4 guns remained operational, if ammunition held out, and if his Marines could maintain their positions under the intense pressure that was about to fall on them like a physical weight. The leftmost gun opened fire first, its gunner having spotted concentrated movement along the steepest part of the ravine, where Japanese soldiers were using tree roots and rocky outcrops to climb toward the Marine positions. The distinctive hammering of the M1917 echoed across the ridge, a rapid-fire percussion that immediately drew return fire from Japanese rifles and light machine guns positioned in the jungle below. Tracers began crisscrossing the darkness like malevolent fireflies, green Japanese rounds arcing upward toward the Marine positions, while red American tracers plunged downward into the ravine, each streak of light marking the path of 4 additional rounds that remained invisible. Paige moved to the second gun position as its crew engaged targets moving along the eastern approach, their weapon adding its voice to the growing symphony of violence that was transforming the quiet ridge into a killing field. The water-cooled system that made these guns so heavy also gave them a crucial advantage that lighter weapons could never match. They could fire continuously without the barrel changes required by air-cooled models that would overheat after a few minutes of sustained fire. As long as ammunition held out and water circulated through the cooling jacket, each M1917 could maintain its maximum rate of fire indefinitely, delivering the kind of sustained suppressive fire that defensive doctrine demanded. The Japanese assault was not the disorganized banzai charge that American propaganda films would later portray to audiences back home. These were veteran soldiers using proven tactics developed through years of warfare in China and the Pacific. Small groups advancing under covering fire, using terrain features to mask their movement, concentrating overwhelming force against specific points in the Marine line before attempting to exploit any breakthrough with follow-on forces. They moved with the confidence of men who had conquered Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the Central Pacific, soldiers who expected American resistance to collapse once sufficient pressure was applied to the defensive line. But they had not encountered defensive fire like this before. The 4 machine guns were delivering approximately 1,800 to 2,400 rounds per minute of sustained fire into the ravine, each burst precisely aimed to catch advancing troops in exposed positions as they tried to cross open ground. The plunging fire from the ridge gave the Marines a tremendous advantage that compensated for their numerical inferiority. Japanese soldiers moving uphill were silhouetted against the lighter sky behind them, while the Marine positions remained hidden in the darkness above, invisible except for the muzzle flashes that drew increasingly accurate return fire. Every flash from below revealed new targets for the machine gunners, who shifted fire with practiced efficiency from one concentration of enemy troops to another. 20 minutes into the engagement, the first M1917 went silent. Its gunner slumped over the weapon with a Japanese sniper's bullet through his chest. Paige sprinted to the position, dragging the wounded Marine clear and taking his place behind the gun without hesitation. The weapon was still functional, its water jacket warm but not overheated, ammunition belt properly seated and ready to fire. He swung the gun toward a cluster of Japanese soldiers who had reached the midpoint of the ravine, pressing the trigger and feeling the familiar vibration as the weapon sent a stream of .30 caliber rounds into the advancing formation. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly in ways that threatened to overwhelm the defensive positions. Japanese artillery had found the range to the ridge, and shells were beginning to fall among the Marine positions with increasing accuracy, forcing gunners to hunker down between fire missions. The enemy infantry assault was gaining momentum despite the heavy casualties inflicted by the machine guns, with some Japanese soldiers reaching positions only 50 yards from the ridgeline. Radio communications with battalion headquarters were sporadic, interrupted by static and the overwhelming noise of combat that made verbal orders nearly impossible to hear. This made it difficult to coordinate supporting fires or call for reinforcements that might not even be available. Paige's section was beginning to take casualties as the Japanese found their range. A mortar round exploded between 2 gun positions, killing the assistant gunner on the 3rd weapon and wounding 2 ammunition bearers who had been moving forward with fresh belts. Shrapnel from the same round disabled the traverse mechanism on the 2nd gun, limiting its ability to shift fire across its assigned sector. The Marines were adapting as they had been trained to do, with wounded men continuing to feed ammunition and spot targets, while replacement gunners moved up from reserve positions to take over weapons whose crews had been hit. The intensity of fire from both sides created a surreal environment where normal communication was impossible. Orders were passed by hand signals and shouted commands that often went unheard above the constant chatter of automatic weapons. The smell of cordite and burned powder mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the earthy odor of freshly churned mud. Spent brass casings accumulated in piles around each gun position, creating hazardous footing for Marines who had to move quickly between weapons. Despite the casualties, Paige's defensive plan was working exactly as designed. The Japanese assault was stalling, as companies that had begun the attack with full strength found themselves reduced to scattered squads pinned down in the ravine by continuous machine gun fire. Bodies were accumulating at the base of the ridge, grim evidence of the effectiveness of plunging fire delivered by weapons that military doctrine was already beginning to phase out in favor of lighter, more mobile alternatives. But the enemy was adapting too, learning from each failed assault wave. Japanese squad leaders began concentrating their remaining forces for coordinated brave rushes against specific sections of the Marine line, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for the possibility of overwhelming individual gun positions through sheer weight of numbers. Small groups of infiltrators were working their way around the flanks of the ridge, seeking to attack the machine gun positions from behind, while the weapons were focused on threats to their front. At 0430 hours, the tactical situation reached its critical point. A Japanese platoon had fought its way to within grenade range of the rightmost gun position, forcing its crew to abandon their weapon and fall back to secondary positions to avoid being overrun. Almost simultaneously, enemy soldiers armed with satchel charges were spotted moving along the reverse slope of the ridge, attempting to approach the remaining machine guns from their blind side, where the weapons could not be brought to bear. The overlapping fields of fire that had made Paige's defense so effective were beginning to break down as individual weapons were knocked out or forced to shift position. The ridge was still holding, but barely. 3 of the 4 machine guns remained operational, though all had taken casualties among their crews. Ammunition was running low for the weapons that had been firing almost continuously for over an hour, consuming thousands of rounds. Most critically, the Japanese were no longer content to attack frontally into the teeth of the machine gun positions. They were beginning to find ways around and through the Marine defenses, threatening to turn a successful defensive engagement into a catastrophic breakthrough that would expose Henderson Field to direct assault from forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to die to accomplish their mission. The breakthrough came at 0500 hours, announced by the distinctive crack of Japanese rifle grenades exploding among the Marine positions and the sharp bark of enemy voices shouting coordinates in the pre-dawn darkness. A full company of the 29th Infantry Regiment had worked their way up the steep eastern slope of the ridge, using the cover of artillery fire and the distraction of frontal assaults to approach the Marine line from an unexpected angle that the defensive plan had not fully accounted for. They hit Company F's positions with concentrated force, overwhelming 2 rifle squads and creating a gap in the defensive line that threatened to split Paige's machine gun section from the rest of the battalion. The tactical reality was brutal and immediate. Japanese soldiers were now fighting on the ridge itself, within the Marine perimeter, close enough that machine gun fire became impossible without hitting friendly troops who were locked in hand-to-hand combat. The carefully planned fields of fire that had decimated enemy formations in the ravine became useless when the battle moved to close quarters where rifles and bayonets mattered more than sustained automatic fire. Paige could see enemy soldiers silhouetted against the grey sky as dawn approached, moving between fighting positions with the confidence of men who believed they had broken through the American line. Some carried the curved samurai swords that Japanese officers still carried into battle as symbols of their warrior heritage. Others were armed with the short-barreled rifles and grenades that were more practical for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. His second machine gun fell silent as its crew was overrun by a Japanese squad that had infiltrated through the gap in Company F's line. The gunner died at his weapon, still trying to traverse the heavy barrel toward enemies who were too close and moving too fast for the cumbersome M1917 to engage effectively. The assistant gunner managed to destroy the gun's firing pin with a grenade before a Japanese bayonet found him, denying the weapon to enemy forces but removing another crucial element from Paige's defensive firepower. The ridge was collapsing section by section as Japanese forces exploited their breakthrough, rolling up the Marine line from east to west in a tactical maneuver that threatened to achieve in minutes what hours of frontal assault had failed to accomplish. Paige could hear the distinctive sound of American voices calling for corpsmen, the sharp crack of Montgarand rifles firing in rapid succession, and the deeper boom of Japanese knee mortars dropping rounds directly into Marine foxholes, from ranges so short that traditional artillery support was impossible to coordinate. The battle had devolved into the kind of desperate close-quarters fighting that favored Japanese tactics and training, Small unit actions where individual courage and weapon skill mattered more than coordinated fires or tactical advantage. With 28 of his original 33 Marines now dead or wounded, Paige faced a decision that would define not only his own survival, but the fate of Henderson Field itself and the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The 3rd machine gun was still operational, positioned to cover the western approach to the ridge, but its crew had been reduced to a single ammunition bearer who was feeding belts while simultaneously trying to spot targets through the smoke and confusion of close combat. The 4th gun had taken a direct hit from a knee mortar, its water jacket cracked and steaming like a tea kettle, the weapon itself twisted into uselessness by the explosion that had killed its crew. His tactical plan emerged from desperation and clarity in equal measure. The heavy machine guns that had served so effectively in fixed defensive positions could be transformed into assault weapons if someone was willing to accept the physical punishment of firing them without proper support. The M1917 weighed 47 pounds without its tripod, still a massive burden for one man but manageable for short distances if the tactical situation demanded it and survival depended on mobility. More importantly, its sustained fire capability remained intact regardless of how it was mounted or supported. The water-cooled barrel could still deliver continuous fire that would overwhelm enemy positions. Paige disconnected the 3rd machine gun from its tripod, lifted the weapon by its carrying handle, and began moving toward the gap in the Marine line where Japanese soldiers were consolidating their breakthrough. The gun's ammunition belt dragged behind him through the mud, 250 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition that would have to last until he could reach additional supplies or until the weapon itself was destroyed by enemy fire. His tactical concept was to use the psychological impact of sustained machine gun fire to break up the Japanese advance, creating enough confusion and casualties to allow surviving Marines to reorganize their defense before the entire position collapsed completely. The first burst caught a Japanese squad by complete surprise as they moved between abandoned Marine positions, confident that organized resistance on this section of the ridge had ended. Paige fired from a standing position, bracing the weapon against his hip and using his left hand to guide the barrel while his right hand worked the trigger mechanism. The recoil was tremendous, each shot driving the heavy weapon back against his body with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks. But the psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese soldiers who had been advancing in relative security suddenly found themselves under fire from a weapon they thought had been silenced, a single Marine with a crew-served gun engaging enemy forces at point-blank range. The tactical situation was unlike anything in Marine Corps training manuals or Japanese infantry doctrine. A single man with a weapon designed for 3-man crews was engaging enemy forces in close combat, delivering sustained automatic fire while moving across terrain that made stable firing positions impossible. The water-cooled barrel began to overheat without the stationary tripod to provide proper heat dissipation, but the weapon continued to function as Paige advanced from one covered position to another, engaging targets of opportunity and disrupting Japanese attempts to exploit their breakthrough. Enemy return fire was intense and accurate. Experienced soldiers who recognized the threat and responded with everything they had. Rifle bullets snapped past his head, chipping fragments from the coral rock that formed the ridge's backbone. A Japanese grenade exploded close enough to shower him with debris and temporarily deafen his left ear. But the machine gun continued to function despite the punishment it was receiving. He could see individual Japanese soldiers taking cover behind Marine fighting positions, using captured American equipment and ammunition while trying to locate the source of the devastating fire that was cutting apart their carefully planned assault with mechanical efficiency. During one magazine change, crouched behind the twisted remains of a palm tree that had been shattered by artillery, Paige spotted a Japanese officer attempting to rally his men for a coordinated counterattack. The officer was perhaps 30 yards away, visible in profile as he gestured toward Paige's position, while shouting orders to soldiers scattered among the ridge's defensive positions. When the officer began to draw what appeared to be a traditional samurai sword, intending to lead a charge personally, Paige shifted his aim and triggered a sustained burst that ended both the rallying attempt and any organized Japanese response to his unprecedented one-man assault. The psychological impact of sustained machine gun fire delivered by a single Marine moving across the battlefield was beginning to affect Japanese tactical decisions in ways their commanders had not anticipated. Squad leaders who had been confidently exploiting their breakthrough now found themselves forced to take cover and respond to threats from unexpected directions. The coordinated advance that had overwhelmed Marine positions was fragmenting into individual firefights as Japanese soldiers found themselves engaged by a weapon that should have required a three-man crew operating from prepared positions with ammunition bearers and supporting infantry. But the physical toll was becoming unsustainable, even for a Marine who had spent 6 years training with machine guns. The M1917 was not designed for the punishment Paige was inflicting on it, and the weapon was beginning to show signs of serious mechanical stress. The barrel was glowing red-hot despite the water cooling system, visible even in the pre-dawn darkness. The sustained firing without proper maintenance was causing feed problems that required manual intervention to clear precious seconds when he was vulnerable to enemy fire. More critically, his ammunition supply was nearly exhausted, and the Japanese forces on the ridge were beginning to adapt to his tactics by coordinating their fire and movement to trap him in positions where the heavy weapon's bulk became a liability rather than an asset. The ridge remained contested, with Japanese soldiers holding portions of the Marine line, while Paige's extraordinary assault had prevented them from consolidating their breakthrough into a complete tactical victory that would have opened Henderson Field to direct attack. Bodies from both sides littered the fighting positions, evidence of the intensity of combat that had transformed a defensive engagement into close-quarters battle where individual weapons and personal courage determined outcomes more than tactical doctrine. Henderson Field remained in American hands, but barely. The cost of holding it was mounting with each passing minute as Japanese reinforcements continued to feed into the battle from positions that American forces had not yet been able to identify or suppress with artillery fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dawn came slowly to the ridge, grey light filtering through smoke and cordite haze that hung over the battlefield like a shroud. The silence was almost more unsettling than the gunfire had been, broken only by the occasional groan of wounded men calling for water, the metallic click of weapons being reloaded, and the distant sound of Marine reinforcements moving up through the jungle below to retake the lost positions. Paige sat slumped against the remains of his final machine gun position, the M1917's barrel still warm to the touch despite the tropical morning air. Its water jacket was cracked and leaking from the punishment of sustained fire without proper support, steam rising from the fissures like breath from a dying animal. The tactical accounting of the night's battle would not be completed for hours, but the immediate evidence was spread across every yard of the ridge's contested ground. Japanese bodies lay in clusters where concentrated machine gun fire had caught assault formations in the open, unable to take cover quickly enough to avoid the plunging fire from elevated positions. Individual soldiers sprawled among Marine fighting positions where close-quarters combat had determined survival, and scattered equipment from both sides told the story of desperate fighting in conditions where normal tactical doctrine had dissolved into personal courage and weapon reliability. Major Odell Connolly arrived with 17 Marines scraped together from headquarters personnel, bandsmen, and kitchen staff, men who had trained as infantry but spent the past months performing support duties that kept Henderson Field operational. They moved carefully among the defensive positions, checking for Japanese soldiers who might be feigning death or preparing final attacks with concealed grenades, the kind of desperate measures that characterized Pacific warfare. The ridge had to be secured completely before wounded Marines could be evacuated, and defensive preparations could begin for the inevitable follow-up assault that Japanese doctrine demanded after any tactical setback. The body count began at the leftmost machine gun position where Paige's defense had started 8 hours earlier. 98 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the ridge itself, their bodies intermingled with the positions they had briefly captured during the pre-dawn breakthrough. Most had died from sustained machine gun fire delivered at ranges where the .30 caliber rounds had tremendous stopping power, but others showed evidence of the close-quarters fighting that had characterized the battle's final phase. Bayonet wounds, grenade fragments, and the distinctive injuries caused by rifle fire at point-blank range where men fought face-to-face. In the ravine below the ridge, Marine counting parties discovered approximately 200 additional Japanese casualties, evidence of the devastating effectiveness of plunging fire from elevated positions. These soldiers had died during the initial assault phases, when Paige's 4 machine guns were operating from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire that created kill zones impossible to cross without taking catastrophic casualties. The tactical lesson was clear and would influence Marine Corps defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war. Japanese forces had paid an enormous price for every yard of ground gained, with casualty rates that would have broken less determined units long before they reached the Marine defensive line. The M1917 machine guns themselves told their own story of the night's fighting, silent testimony to the weapons that military theorists had declared obsolete. The first gun, abandoned when its crew was killed early in the battle, had fired approximately 3,000 rounds before a Japanese grenade disabled its traverse mechanism. The second weapon had been destroyed by its own crew to prevent capture, its firing pin removed and barrel spiked with a thermite grenade that had welded the breech mechanism into uselessness. The third gun, the one Paige had carried into his final assault, showed extreme wear from sustained firing without proper maintenance. Its barrel was scored by heat stress, the water jacket had multiple fractures from the punishment of mobile combat, and the feed mechanism was clogged with debris from the battlefield. Only the fourth machine gun remained in working condition, though its ammunition supply was nearly exhausted and its crew reduced to a single wounded Marine who had continued feeding belts despite shrapnel wounds in both arms. This weapon had maintained continuous fire for over 6 hours, expending approximately 4,000 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition while engaging targets at ranges from 800 yards down to less than 50 yards. During the final phase of fighting when Japanese soldiers reached the Marine perimeter. The effectiveness of these obsolete weapons in defensive positions was undeniable to anyone who examined the battlefield evidence. But their limitations had become equally apparent through the night's combat. The M1917s required enormous amounts of ammunition to maintain their rate of fire, logistical support that was difficult to provide during extended engagements when supply lines were cut. Their weight made repositioning almost impossible once battle was joined, forcing crews to fight and die at their assigned positions rather than maneuvering to meet changing tactical situations. Most critically, their effectiveness dropped dramatically when enemy forces closed to ranges where rapid traverse and elevation changes were required to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Yet the tactical results spoke for themselves in ways that no doctrine manual could dispute. Approximately 298 Japanese soldiers had been killed in Paige's immediate sector, casualties inflicted primarily by weapons that military doctrine was already beginning to phase out in favor of lighter, more mobile alternatives. The sustained fire capability that made the M1917 so cumbersome had also made them devastatingly effective against infantry formations attacking across open ground, particularly when positioned to deliver plunging fire from elevated terrain that multiplied their destructive effect. The human cost of holding the ridge was equally significant and would not be forgotten by those who survived. Of Paige's original 33 Marines, only 7 had survived the night unwounded, and 3 of those were walking wounded, who had continued fighting despite injuries that would have hospitalized them under normal circumstances. 26 Marines had paid with their lives or serious wounds for the tactical decision to hold this piece of ground, a casualty rate of nearly 80% that reflected both the intensity of Japanese attacks and the effectiveness of enemy tactics once they closed to rifle range, where machine guns became less dominant. Medical personnel working among the scattered fighting positions found evidence of the exceptional courage that had characterized the defense beyond what any citation could capture. Marines had died at their weapons, continued fighting with multiple wounds, and in several cases had used their own bodies to shield damaged equipment from enemy fire. One ammunition bearer had crawled nearly 50 yards while wounded to deliver belts to an isolated machine gun, dying within reach of the weapon he was trying to resupply. Another Marine had used his final grenade to destroy a machine gun rather than allow it to fall into Japanese hands, sacrificing his own life to deny the weapon to enemy forces. The broader tactical situation was slowly becoming clear as radio communications with other sectors of the Lunga perimeter were re-established and reports filtered in from adjacent units. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had suffered catastrophic casualties during the night's fighting, with some companies reduced to squad strength and others effectively eliminated as fighting units. The coordinated assault that was supposed to overwhelm American positions and seize Henderson Field had been broken against defensive positions held by Marines who refused to yield ground regardless of the odds against them. But the cost had been enormous on both sides, the kind of attritional warfare that neither nation could sustain indefinitely. The ridge was littered with equipment that would have to be replaced, weapons that would require extensive maintenance or complete replacement, and most importantly, experienced Marines whose knowledge and leadership could not be easily replaced by fresh recruits arriving from training camps back in the United States. The defensive victory had been achieved through the kind of sacrifice that could not be sustained indefinitely, particularly given the limited reinforcements available in the South Pacific Theater, where every resource was stretched thin. As the morning progressed and the full scope of the night's fighting became apparent to higher command, Paige began to understand that something fundamental had changed during those 8 hours of desperate combat. The ridge had held against overwhelming odds. Henderson Field remained in American hands, denying the Japanese control of the one asset that made Guadalcanal strategically valuable. And Japanese forces had suffered casualties that would prevent them from mounting another major assault for weeks or possibly months. But the Marines who had achieved this victory were no longer the same men who had prepared their positions the previous evening, and the weapons that had made their success possible were relics from an earlier war that had proven their worth under conditions their designers had never anticipated. Water-cooled machine guns designed for trench warfare in France had held off a regiment-sized assault in the jungles of the Pacific, demonstrating that tactical effectiveness depended more on proper employment than technological sophistication. The counterattack began at 0800 hours on October 26th, not with the thunderous artillery barrage that doctrine prescribed, but with the quiet movement of Marines who understood that momentum gained through defensive victory had to be exploited before Japanese forces could reorganize and establish new defensive positions. Paige, despite exhaustion that made his hands shake when he tried to reload his rifle, found himself leading a composite force of survivors from multiple units toward Japanese positions that intelligence reports indicated were still occupied by disorganized elements of the 29th Infantry Regiment. The tactical situation had fundamentally shifted during those 8 hours of night fighting, where Japanese forces had held the initiative and dictated the terms of engagement. They were now scattered in small groups throughout the jungle, many cut off from their parent units and lacking the communication lines necessary for coordinated resistance. The Marines, bloodied but victorious, possessed detailed knowledge of terrain that Japanese forces had crossed in darkness, intimate familiarity with fields of fire, and cover positions that could be used to exploit enemy weaknesses rather than defend against enemy strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller's arrival with elements of the 7th Marines provided the additional manpower necessary to transform tactical success into strategic advantage. His reputation for aggressive leadership was already legendary among Marines who had served with him in Nicaragua and China, where he had earned the nickname Chesty through countless small unit actions. But the Guadalcanal campaign was proving that jungle warfare in the Pacific required adaptation of tactics that had worked in different terrain against different enemies. The ridge fighting had demonstrated that defensive positions could be held against overwhelming odds when properly prepared and stubbornly defended. But clearing operations would require the kind of coordinated small unit actions where individual initiative and weapons skill mattered more than formal tactical doctrine or superior numbers. Paige's new role reflected both his demonstrated competence under extreme pressure and the Marine Corps' practical approach to battlefield promotion that valued performance over formal credentials. A field commission to second lieutenant would not come until December, but his immediate assignment as acting platoon leader acknowledged what the night's fighting had already proven. That leadership under combat conditions emerged from performance rather than rank structure, from the ability to make decisions under fire rather than from classroom instruction. His tactical ideas had saved Henderson Field when the strategic situation hung by a thread. Now those same ideas would be tested in offensive operations, where the margin for error was equally thin, but the consequences of failure were measured in strategic rather than tactical terms. The advance into the jungle south of the ridge revealed the full extent of Japanese casualties from the previous night's fighting, evidence scattered across approaches that assault formations had used to reach the Marine defensive line. Bodies lay where wounds or equipment failures had forced them to take cover, while entire squads had been wiped out when concentrated fire caught them crossing open ground, where no natural protection existed against plunging machine gun fire from elevated positions. Equipment abandoned by Japanese forces told its own story of tactical disintegration under unbearable pressure that broke unit cohesion. Rifles discarded when ammunition ran out, machine guns abandoned when crews were killed, and personal equipment scattered along withdrawal routes that showed how organized units had dissolved into individual soldiers seeking escape rather than attempting to maintain combat effectiveness as fighting units. The 29th Infantry Regiment, which had begun the assault with approximately 3,000 men representing the cream of Japanese combat forces in the South Pacific, was now scattered across miles of jungle terrain in groups too small to mount effective resistance against coordinated Marine advances. But the human cost of the previous night's fighting was equally evident among the Marine formations moving through captured Japanese positions. Units that had begun the campaign at full strength were now operating with casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic under normal circumstances. Experienced non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of small unit leadership had been killed or wounded at rates that threatened unit cohesion, while replacement personnel lacked the jungle warfare experience necessary for effective operations against an enemy that remained dangerous despite tactical defeat. The counterattack's objectives were limited but strategically crucial, reflecting lessons learned from previous Pacific campaigns. Rather than attempting to exploit tactical success through deep penetration that might expose Marine forces to counterattack from Japanese reserves, the advance was designed to eliminate organized resistance within artillery range of Henderson Field, while establishing defensive positions that could withstand future enemy assaults that were certain to come. The ridge fighting had proven that defensive victories were possible against overwhelming odds when Marines refused to yield ground. But those victories required preparation, positioning, and weapon systems that might not be available for subsequent engagements as the campaign pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory. Paige's Marines encountered scattered Japanese resistance throughout the morning advance, but nothing resembling the coordinated defensive fire that had characterized enemy positions before the ridge assault shattered their offensive capability. Individual soldiers armed with rifles and grenades fought with the desperation of men who understood that surrender was not an option in a war where neither side gave quarter. But their isolated actions could not prevent Marine forces from systematically clearing positions that had taken Japanese engineers weeks to prepare, positions that were now being turned against their original builders. The tactical initiative had shifted decisively, and Japanese forces lacked both the manpower and the coordination necessary to regain control of terrain that commanded the approaches to Henderson Field. By midday, Marine patrols had advanced nearly 2 miles beyond the ridge without encountering organized resistance, a penetration that would have been impossible before the night's fighting had eliminated effective Japanese offensive capability in this sector. Radio communications with other elements of the Lunga perimeter confirmed that similar advances were occurring along multiple sections of the defensive line, evidence that the coordinated Japanese assault had failed not just tactically but strategically. The offensive that was meant to drive American forces into the sea had instead destroyed the Japanese 2nd Division's ability to threaten Henderson Field for the foreseeable future. The strategic implications became clear during afternoon briefings at division headquarters, where casualty reports and intelligence assessments painted a picture of Japanese defeat that went far beyond tactical setback. The 2nd Division had lost approximately 2,200 men during the failed assault, casualties that represented nearly 70% of its effective strength and eliminated its capability for offensive operations that required coordinated multi-unit actions. More importantly, the failure had cost Japanese forces their last realistic opportunity to recapture Henderson Field before American reinforcements could arrive in sufficient numbers to make the position impregnable. Ships were already en route from Pearl Harbor carrying fresh troops, additional aircraft, and the heavy equipment necessary to expand the Lunga perimeter into a fortress that could withstand anything the Japanese could throw at it. For Paige personally, the transformation from defensive survivor to offensive leader reflected the Marine Corps' recognition that combat effectiveness emerged from demonstrated performance rather than formal training or rank structure. His tactical understanding of weapon capabilities, terrain utilization, and small unit coordination had proven decisive during the ridge defense, qualities that were equally valuable during offensive operations, where the same principles applied in reverse. The obsolete machine guns that had saved Henderson Field were being replaced by newer weapons as supply ships arrived with modern equipment. But the tactical lessons learned during 8 hours of desperate fighting would influence Marine Corps doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. The broader campaign implications were becoming apparent as intelligence reports confirmed the elimination of Japanese offensive capability on Guadalcanal for the immediate future. What had begun as a desperate defensive action to hold an isolated airfield had evolved into a strategic victory that established American control over a forward base capable of supporting further advances into the Central Pacific. The ridge that Paige and 33 Marines had held against overwhelming odds had become the foundation for offensive operations that would eventually reach the Japanese home islands themselves. As evening approached on October 26, exactly 24 hours after the Japanese assault had begun with such high hopes, Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands. The airstrip continued operations, supporting aircraft that would soon be carrying the war to Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands chain. The ridge south of the field was now part of an expanded defensive perimeter that could accommodate the reinforcements already en route from Australia and the United States. Most importantly, the psychological impact of Japanese defeat was beginning to affect enemy strategic planning throughout the Pacific, where commanders who had assumed American forces would collapse under sustained pressure were discovering that Marines would fight for seemingly insignificant pieces of ground with a determination that defied rational military calculation. On May 21, 1943, in Balcombe, Australia, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige stood at attention as Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division. Read the citation that would change his life forever. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor, was being presented for actions that had occurred 7 months earlier on a rain-soaked ridge that most Americans had never heard of. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with a company of Marines in combat against enemy Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands on October 26, 1942. When the enemy broke through the line directly in front of his position, Platoon Sergeant Paige, commanding a machine gun section with fearless determination, continued to direct the fire of his gunners until all his men were either killed or wounded." The words continued, describing how he had fought alone against overwhelming odds, moving from gun to gun, maintaining fire that should have required multiple crews to sustain. How he had eventually led a bayonet charge that drove the enemy back and prevented a breakthrough that could have lost Henderson Field. But the citation could not capture the full reality of what had happened that night, the physical and mental endurance required to keep fighting when every rational instinct screamed to retreat. Vandergrift finished reading and looked directly at Paige. "This Medal of Honor belongs to all 33 men in my platoon on Guadalcanal," Paige responded, his voice steady despite the emotion of remembering the Marines who had not survived to see this moment. It was a sentiment he would repeat for the rest of his life, never claiming sole credit for a victory that had been purchased with the blood of men whose names most would never know. The presentation ceremony was a joint event honoring Paige alongside fellow Guadalcanal Medal of Honor recipients Merritt Edson and John Basilone, attended by Marine Corps leadership and covered in military dispatches that highlighted their collective heroism. But for Paige, the true significance of the award was not the recognition it brought him personally, but what it represented about the Marines who had held that ridge when holding seemed impossible. The official recognition validated tactical decisions that had challenged conventional military wisdom about the obsolescence of heavy weapons in modern warfare. Paige's use of water-cooled machine guns in sustained defensive roles had proven more effective than mobile doctrine suggested, demonstrating that equipment effectiveness depended entirely on tactical application rather than technological sophistication. The weapons that theorists dismissed as relics had dominated a modern battlefield through superior performance in their intended role. Henderson Field remained in American hands for the duration of the Guadalcanal campaign, its runways operational for the aircraft that would support subsequent offensive operations throughout the Solomon Islands. The strategic implications extended far beyond a single defensive engagement. Control of the airfield enabled continued American advancement through the Pacific theater, while the Japanese failure to retake it marked the beginning of their strategic withdrawal from the region. The battle for Henderson Field, as military historians would later call it, became a case study in defensive warfare, taught at military academies for generations. The tactical lessons were clear. Proper positioning of heavy weapons, careful preparation of defensive positions, and stubborn refusal to yield ground could multiply combat effectiveness far beyond simple personnel ratios. But the human element was equally important, the courage of individual Marines who fought on despite wounds, exhaustion, and overwhelming odds. Paige accepted reassignment to the United States for war bond tours, his Medal of Honor making him valuable for home front morale operations that raised millions of dollars for the war effort. But his understanding of defensive warfare had been fundamentally altered by the Henderson Field experience. The obsolete weapons that had saved his sector were not obsolete at all when properly employed. They were precisely the right tools for the tactical situation that had developed in the jungles of Guadalcanal, where sustained fire mattered more than mobility, and where continuous operation mattered more than technological innovation. The Browning M1917 would continue to serve in secondary roles throughout the Pacific War, gradually replaced by lighter weapons as doctrine evolved. But its final moment of glory on that ridge south of Henderson Field demonstrated a truth that military planners often forgot. The best weapon for any situation is the one that accomplishes the mission, regardless of what textbooks say about its obsolescence. Years later, Paige would reflect on that night with the clarity that only distance and time could provide. "We were just Marines doing our job," he would say to anyone who asked about his heroism. "The guns worked, the position held. Henderson Field stayed in American hands. That's all that mattered." But historians would see something more in the battle, a turning point where American forces demonstrated they could stand against Japanese assaults that had swept everything before them across the Pacific. A moment where obsolete weapons in the hands of determined defenders proved more effective than newer technology in the hands of attackers who underestimated American resolve. The ridge south of Henderson Field became hallowed ground in Marine Corps history, a place where 33 men with 4 heavy machine guns held the line when holding seemed impossible, where a single Marine, faced with the choice between retreat and destruction, chose instead to carry a weapon designed for 3 men and use it to break an enemy assault, where water-cooled machine guns from the First World War proved they still had lessons to teach about defensive warfare in the modern age. Mitchell Paige would retire from the Marine Corps as a colonel in 1959, having served through the Korean War and into the Cold War era. He would live until 2003, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. But his legacy was not measured in rank or years of service. It was measured in the fact that Henderson Field never fell, that American forces maintained their foothold in the Solomon Islands, and that the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn on a rain-soaked ridge where obsolete weapons proved they were anything but obsolete when Marines refused to let them be. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.